Thanks for coming back for this session. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I wanted to frame this discussion with a little story. I want you to come with me to New York City in an elevator in one of those hoity-toity clubs. I won't tell which one, not to embarrass them, but it was one of those places where Ivy League people go to talk deep thoughts and have lunch and spend too much money. And I was in an elevator meeting a friend at this place. And there were two other people in the elevator. One was an older gentleman who had clearly been a member of the club for a long time, and the other person was a much younger man. And the older fellow said to the younger man, "I see there's a meeting for the Robin Hood Foundation here today. Can you tell me more about that?" And the young man said, "Yes, I can. In fact, I'm running the meeting." He said, "Well, tell me about the Robin Hood Foundation." "Well, it's a relief and development organization. We help the poor." And the older gentleman sort of gave him a blank look and said, he didn't say anything. The younger man said, "Well, we're a humanitarian organization, so we raise money and provide humanitarian support for people who need it." There was still a quizzical look. And then the old man said, "Oh, Robin Hood, I get it. So you take money from wealthy people and you give it to the poor. I understand now. It all makes sense." That quizzical look is one that I have experienced many times. Before I came to the Institute, I worked for World Vision, a Christian humanitarian relief organization. Many times I would say to a member of the church or a fellow Christian that I worked for a relief and development NGO. Well, that's the first blank look. Then, a humanitarian organization. Well, what's that? Well, we provide help to the poor. Oh, okay, right, I understand. There's sort of a language gap in some ways. What we want to talk about in this panel is how Christians are involved in the humanitarian sphere. We are extremely privileged to have two very experienced guests with us to talk through this. Michael Gerson is a fellow now at the Council on Foreign Relations. He spent many years working in the White House, writing speeches for President Bush and also providing policy and strategic advice. You can read all about his resume in the program. And he's just an awesome, warm Christian, and you will get to hear from him on his writings. He's a contributor to Newsweek. He also has a syndicated column in the Washington Post. Ambassador Brady Anderson headed up USAID, the U.S. government's aid arm, during the Clinton administration, and was also U.S. ambassador to Tanzania and has a breadth of experience working for SIL and Wycliffe Bible translators. He's involved with World Vision. These are two very experienced, wise Christians. I ask you to welcome them to this discussion, please. Well, it's been our custom in these last two sessions to work, as Josh said this morning, from the inside out. We wanted to start with a question: what you understood while growing up. What did you understand about religion and the world, and how did those pieces come together? Brady, I know that you have a story you'd like to tell from your growing up in the South. Let's right. Hear some of that.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yeah. I grew up in a small town in Arkansas called Helena. It's right on the Mississippi River. It was a town of about 12,000 or so people, half of whom were white and half were black. I say that because if you grew up in the 50s and 60s in the South, you know the importance that made. So it was a very segregated town, so it was very typical in that sense of the rest of the South. Racially, blacks and whites were segregated. I had no black friends as a child, even though we were together all the time. So what I'm going to say about religious identity really pertains and derives from the white community, which is what I knew best. I grew up in the Methodist Church, so I was a WASP. I didn't know what WASPs were, but a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We also had a very large Catholic community, primarily thinking back on it Italian by the names of all the families, the Messinas and St. Columbias and those people that I remember. It was even a Catholic school from K through 12, although their high school closed when I was in high school. So all the Catholic kids came into the public school with the rest of us during that time. And the third religious grouping we had was a very large, for a town that size, Jewish community, a large synagogue, very active Jewish community in that town. And then we actually had a significant population of Chinese Americans. So that was an ethnic diversity, but all the Chinese, I'm thinking back and trying to remember, all the Chinese I knew went to the Baptist church. I'm not aware of any other religious affiliation that they had. I suspect there may have been perhaps Buddhist practice in their homes. I'm not really sure because those families hadn't been there that long, but the Chinese were Southern Baptists. So the Protestant, the Catholic, and the Jewish identities were very strong, and they determined a lot of things about how we interacted with one another. There were certain rules about, some groups were more conservative about dating or at what age they could date, or alcohol use, or dancing, or even the girls using makeup. There were also some what I would now call Pentecostal Protestants who had a little bit more conservative, but they were much smaller in number. One evening, I remember my bedroom was next to my parents' bedroom in our house, and there was an adjoining door, and it was always there was no air conditioning. How did we ever live in the South without air conditioning? And so the door was always cracked open at night when we were asleep. And I heard my sister come in there one night after she'd come home from a date, and she was tearful and came into primarily the mother and said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, Don Woods and Ann Kelly have broken up." Teenage crisis. And I said, "Well, what happened? What happened?" She said, "Well, their parents told them they could no longer date." And she said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, Don, as you know, they're Presbyterian, and Ann Kelly they're Catholics. They can't date." And why is that? My sister cried, and it's so unfair, it's so unjust. And Mother said, "Well, it's because if you date, back those days people got married earlier than you do now when you're 40. We got married in our 20s. If you date, it can lead to marriage. And then if a Catholic and a Presbyterian marry, what about their children?" So as I look back on that, it was really those rules that prohibited dating. And there was no Jew ever dated a Protestant or a Catholic. No Catholic and Protestant ever dated. Never. And I've talked to my sister and some other people about this recently because I knew I was going to talk about it. And we're unaware that anybody ever married outside their faith. And I think it was because the children, what are they going to be? And so I grew up, I thought every community had this really global identity with these large groupings of religious identity. Religious identity was strong. It was not something you chose. It was something you were born with. I was born as a Protestant, and my friend was born a Jew, and she was born a Catholic. And you would always stay that way. There was no conversion or seeking. There was no question about that. It's just who we were. We accepted it. It was fine. We respected it. To some extent, we tolerated that. And people lived their whole lives together in this small community in the white community, would have been maybe 7,000 people. And we interacted, grew up, and lots of people stayed there. I left, and lived their lives in these separate religious identities, never challenging those. And then when you died in the cemetery, there's a separate black cemetery, and then a large white cemetery, and it was divided Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, so that we were all buried on the same hills there overlooking the Mississippi River, but in separate sections. So I think, what did I learn? I've thought a lot about this getting ready for this, and I think there was a tolerance and a respect, but that religious identity is real. It is absolutely very, very real, and it normally doesn't change, and it defines a lot of how we interact with one another in the world. I still have, of course, friends from those days who practice these other faiths, and it's been interesting for us to talk more as adults about these things. One other thing that I learned from my youth about religion, religious identity in the world, was I grew up, as I said, in the Methodist Church, and I've had this conversation with one of the presidential candidates, and she also grew up in a Methodist church, but a little bit farther north than mine. But we had this conversation about concern for the poor, or what we sometimes has been pejoratively called the social gospel. And very much we got the same thing in the Methodist church. Maybe some of you guys grew up Methodist, I don't know, but it was very much, if you're a Christian, if you're a good Christian, then you care about the poor. And you care about and so the global part was simply, we have poor here, yes, but there's a lot of poor people. And as I recall, the words were China and Africa were the places that we were taught there are lots of poor people. And our obligation was to care about them and give them things if there was some way in which we could do that. And we had offerings and things like that. But that's what I remember about my faith in the world from those years.
Michael, what about you?
Well, I came from a pretty typical Christian Presbyterian upbringing in St. Louis, Missouri, in west of the city, and I guess when we talked earlier, and I began to think about this, about how you start to gain a global view. Part of it was that I met a girl when I was 10 years old. Her parents and my parents were best friends. She was South Korean and adopted, one of the few in St. Louis at that early kind of time. And I'm married to her now. So that gives a little bit of a global view. We've been back to Korea, visited the orphanage where she was, and it is one of the amazing contributions, often of Christian people all across the country, is the adoption of global adoption is an extraordinary thing and a real act of mercy and love that doesn't get enough attention in some way. I was very attracted. My first presidential love, I've always been interested in politics. The first candidate that I really sort of fell for was Jimmy Carter. I remember at my very conservative Christian high school debating for him on his behalf in a mock debate. And then when the votes were counted, I think I was the only one. But part of that was on the foreign policy side, an emphasis on human rights. An outspoken, vocal Christian, someone who was forthright about their faith, and someone who represented a real contrast to the much more narrow foreign policy realism of the Nixon administration. It was much more idealistic, and I think more attuned to the mainstream of kind of Christian idealism in the context of international politics. I eventually was pushed. I feel like I was pushed away from the Democratic Party on life issues throughout the 1980s because I was strongly pro-life, and those divisions solidified in many ways between the two parties in that context. But I eventually went to work. My first Washington job was I worked for Prison Fellowship for Chuck Colson, who was then in Reston, and saw the work of Prison Fellowship International, which was truly extraordinary. How the work they did. Learned several lessons there about, first of all, that people who had committed terrible crimes that I got to know also turned out to be extraordinary examples of the transforming power of God and were more mature Christians than ever I could have hoped to be. But I guess I would have to say that my full immersion on the international side came in many ways after 9/11. I was, I worked on Capitol Hill. I mainly did domestic policy, particularly developing ideas that became known as compassionate conservatism, trying to find ways to aid religious community, faith-based organizations in confronting poverty. But I remember right after 9/11 being up at Camp David with the president in his office and working on some remarks, and with him on the phone on the couch, giving the initial, or a lot of the orders that related to the Afghan campaign, the bombers that were taking off in mid-America, that were going in other places. Just a foreign experience to me. And then, when he was about halfway through the conversation, he was talking with members of Congress, informing them, doing all sorts of things. He put his hand on the phone and said, "Are you cleared for any of this?" And I said, "I honestly don't know." And he said, "You are now." And so, we took a very different turn in an administration that had been very domestically focused, and the President's senior staff made that shift. And I became very focused over time on a reality, which I think the President has spoken about and may not get enough credit for, that in addition to kind of the hard power elements of military power and preempting emerging threats and fighting terrorist networks and opposing state sponsors of terror and all those elements, which were not my expertise. It became very, very clear very quickly that some of the worst threats to America arose from failed states, not from proliferation or other issues. That was certainly the case in Afghanistan. And that there was a direct connection between the future security of the United States and the hope of the rest of the world. That the kind of bitterness, anger, and despair of various regions of the world, because of the proliferation of weapons, because of the growth of terrorist networks, because of the interconnectedness of the world, were emerging as direct threats to the American people. And so I became very interested on the side of looking at genocide, development, human rights, disease, and saw on a variety of issues, I think, some pretty extraordinary progress on malaria, AIDS, and a variety of issues. So that's kind of my story.
Well, hopefully we'll explore many of those issues in great detail further. I wanted to ask what you think of this idea, this theme that we've been wrestling with in this conference of triple citizenships, that as Christians and as people of faith, we have a heavenly affiliation. We as global citizens have a solidarity with the peoples of the world. And then we have our own patriotic affiliations that demand our loyalties and identities and responsibilities in various ways. Is this a helpful way to look at these allegiances? How do you react to that idea of those three responsibilities?
Yeah, I've lived in 4 countries outside the U.S. and I've done cross-cultural studies, and we lived in England for a while and then did cross-cultural studies as well as studying Swahili and Swahili culture in Tanzania. So, I mean, this is the norm, and it's the reality of the world, that multiple identities, even more so than we're accustomed to in the U.S. Most people are very aware that they're all people with lots of different religious identities and different languages and different histories and values, and they live amongst each other. Some places it causes terrible problems, some places not. Let me give a quick example of Tanzania, where I live. Tanzania has somewhere around 120 different languages, or you could call it ethnic groups or tribal groupings. Now, they're related. Some of them are related quite closely, some not so, but there are definitely that many different groups in Tanzania. And Julius Nyerere, who was kind of the George Washington of Tanzania, the first president, and he's now deceased, of that country when they were given their freedom from the British colonial experience in the early 60s. Nyerere knew he had to build a country because one didn't exist. There was no country there before. It was a colony, and before that it was more tribal groupings. There was no country, and he had to create one. He had to create a new identity, adding another level of identity on people's lives. Everyone had their own tribal identity, of which language is a big part, but there was no national identity. And how did he create it? He used Swahili, the Swahili language, which was already spoken along the coast. He used that as the national language, and he did a lot of things. Some of them were controversial about prohibiting kids from speaking their own mother tongue in school and all kinds of things like that. Some of the things didn't work well, but basically he did a good job. He also used, I think, socialism to help create the country, help unite it. He tried to deliver government, to get some sort of allegiance to the idea of the national entity. That national entity had to deliver services to people in terms of education or roads or electricity or water or health. And so he used the model of socialism because he was greatly encouraged and financed by our dear friends in the Nordic countries. They really used Tanzania as their experiment in the third world. A lot of the socialist foolishness, forgive me, has fallen away now, and they're moving more with the rest of the world into free markets. But he did show that the central government cares about people no matter where they live in the country, and it's a real country. It has really borders, and we have a national language. It's Swahili. Swahili was not a foreign tongue. It wasn't a colonial language. He didn't try to use English as the language, which some others have done. He didn't try to use Arabic, which had a history there. He used Swahili, which was it's actually a combination of Bantu languages and Arabic vocabulary. But it was accepted as African, and so it really has worked quite well. The religious mix in Tanzania is somewhere between 40% Christian, 40 to 45 Muslim, and other tribal, traditional African religions. So there is a tension that exists there with that large, sort of almost equal pairing in Christianity and Islam. So Nyeri, who was a Catholic, there's an unwritten rule in the country that they would rotate the presidency between Christian and Muslim. I'm certain it's not in the Constitution. It's an unwritten thing that nobody would violate. So he was a Catholic. Then there was a Muslim from the island of Zanzibar off the coast, which is all Islamic. Then the next one was a Lutheran, and now the current president, Jakaya Kikwete, is a Muslim, even though he doesn't have a Muslim name, but he is a Muslim from the coast. So the next president in Tanzania will have to be apparently a Christian. So that's one way they've tried to work out this identity thing. And we're all Tanzanians, but we recognize that there are these differences, and we have to deal with it. And that's one way they do it. Another interesting thing about identity, we lived in England for 2 years, 85 to 87. My wife and I and our two daughters, and we went to All Nations Christian College, and an international college, preparing students to work cross-culturally. And we lived next door to a church that owned the apartment that we lived in. It's called the Hartford Baptist Church, English Baptist, and got to know those people really well. It was a great place. It was really, I was telling somebody, it's the last church I loved. I hate to say that we've attended for a long, long time. But I was talking to one of my friends there, Ian, about the EU and English, and how did you? He said, "Well, I'm proud to be a European." So I'm very proud to be a European. I said, "Well, tell me about this Europeanness, because it's kind of new to me. You're English, but I'm proud to be European. I like what it represents." He said, "I wasn't born a European. I was born English, but I've taken on this new identity." I said, "Well, what about these other guys I was talking to, whom he knew?" And I said, "They told me they're not European, but yet you're telling me you are. So, and you're really proud of it, and but they don't. They want to keep the pound. They want to keep their passport. They don't, they want to be English." And he says, "Yeah, but I can be English and I can be European." So there's another thing about identity. I mean, to some extent, some people can choose to add another one. Some can let one go. The Tanzanians, a lot of the tribes are able to bring a new Tanzanian identity on top of their tribal identity without giving it up. The Europeans don't have to give up their English identity. They can be European. It's kind of fluid, but it's got its limits. It's that, how fluid it can be and how much it can be changed. One other, again, my experience is really Africa. During the Burundi peace talks, sort of ongoing for a long period of time, Nyerere, while he was still alive, was sort of the moderator, and I was ambassador there, so I was involved in them. And then I left and went to USAID, and I came back out to Tanzania for the Burundi peace talks ongoing with President Clinton, because by then Nyerere had died and President Mandela had been asked to take over. And so Mandela invited Clinton to come out just for a day to try to encourage some reconciliation amongst the Burundi groups. And every time, we talked together with the Tutsis and the Hutus, because they're the same tribal groupings as you find in Rwanda. It's a reflection. The Tutsis the minority and the Hutus the majority. They always went back into history. Always going into history. I remember Nyerere saying and Mandela saying, you got to get away from this history thing. You got to start looking forward. Your identity is too wrapped up in something that happened hundreds of years ago that you've been told about. And every time you come together, you just keep referring back to these terrible things and how this other group abused you. And and then Clinton, I remember he stood up. There were 13 different groups of Burundians who were represented by their parties. And Clinton said, you're enslaving your grandchildren. And that really grabs Africans when you tell them that. You're enslaving your grandchildren to this long history of, that you've even forgotten most of. Don't do that. Can't you envision a new future, same identities, but for your children and your grandchildren, envision a new future together? And it's really, really, really hard to do. These identities are really strong.
I'd only add, it's fascinating, that I think American identity has always been an interesting debate, because it is a nation that comes from a certain history like every other nation, but it's founded on philosophic ideals rooted in the Declaration of Independence. So we have, a history and a set of interests, just like, Sweden or Finland or anybody else. And then we have a set of founding ideals that are, in fact, ambitious and universal. And it's, created an interesting history in many ways. I think that at least since World War II, maybe since World War I, those American ideals based on the Declaration of Independence have led into America into the world in many ways and sustained a public consensus for global engagement. Kind of appealing to that idealism, not just, in the manner of other empires, to seek resources and to, influence balance of power. So from that perspective, it's good. Sometimes, though, the tendency or temptation in that is to conflate American purposes or approaches with God's will or other things. To say that somehow we're a Christian country, which is not exactly the case in that sense. I mean, those Declaration ideals came from two sources. They came from Enlightenment views of human nature, and they came from Judeo-Christian views, anthropology. Not from Christian soteriology or Christian eschatology, but a Christian view of man and his value as created in the image of God. And so a limited kind of conception there. And so America has often faced these, the conflict here. There are, even in the current, when I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations, there are some people on the right, traditional conservatives, that are deeply skeptical of philosophic commitments like the Declaration that lead America into what they believe are commitments that undermine the national interest or are not necessary. And then, of course, on the academic left, there's a significant skepticism of whether you could know any truths about universal truths about human nature, human ideals, or human morality. So it's kind of deep skepticism there. But the American tradition has been kind of it's not a religious tradition, but it's a philosophic view of human nature and identity, a kind of anthropology, a uniquely American anthropology. And it's, I think it's still a powerful thing. I think would be very hard to sustain American commitments in the world, whether it's foreign assistance or fighting disease or a lot of other things, without this kind of secularized Christian version of the image of God, that kind of universality of human rights and dignity. And so, it's interesting because when you're in government, you have a set of interests which you pursue, which you're required to actually by your constitutional obligations. You take an oath to serve the American people and to do so in a way that serves the Constitution. But you also have that added layer of commitments that come from a unique history and set of commitments that says, and it's a radical belief, that every villager, every village child dying of malaria in Zanzibar has exactly the same value before God as every American citizen. Now, not every country's believed that. In fact, most countries have believed that either caste or class or nationality is more important than those kind of basic commitments. So we struggle as a normal nation with our interests, and we also have this set of aspirations that's related to our history.
I'm interested to hear more about how some of these issues hit the road, where the rubber hit the road for you professionally, either at the White House or at USAID. I was intrigued by something you wrote yesterday, Michael, about how in your 5 years in policy discussions in the White House, not once did you hear premillennial dispensationalism used in the policy discussions, and yet there, as you wrote, there is an assumption that those identities, that Christian loyalty is somehow at work in the instruments of the U.S. government. I'm sure at times in your own work, each of you have had to juggle your heavenly allegiance with your patriotic allegiance, with your global interests. I'd be interested to hear more, Michael, in particular, based on your call.
It's a good example. There is a tendency in some academic areas to try to find these interpretive keys to explain why Bush did this, why Bush did that. It's the Israel lobby. It's Christian Zionists, things like that. And I never had that experience in the White House in either of those areas, by the way. I think that is a traditional. I don't want to call it. It's not always anti-Semitic, but it certainly ends in anti-Semitism often. This argument of Jewish conspiracies and power to influence political structures, and you find a lot of that on the left right now. A belief that Jewish neoconservatives or the Israel lobby were somehow manipulative in this system, and it's simply not true. Same with an assumption that somehow that people in the White House are reading the Left Behind series and conducting American foreign policy based on premillennial dispensationalism, which is literally absurd. It's literally absurd, and completely false to my own experience. But let me say, though, that I would not claim that religious views and ideals had no influence in the White House. I remember the president meeting. I helped push for the president to meet with some Chinese dissidents who were house church leaders and who were some of whom were writers and lawyers, most of whom all of whom were Christians and activists with their government. We met over in the Yellow Oval over at the White House, and the first thing the president said to the group was, "I hear you believe in freedom and that you believe in Jesus. It sounds like we have a lot in common." So he very much was oriented towards a view of human rights and dignity, view of human freedom, rooted in a kind of transcendent vision that human beings have this value. As I said, I saw it in the context of kind of an anthropology about what human beings are and what rights they deserve. Not in the context of the end times, not in the context of salvation, the idea of how you're saved or other things, but what your value is as a human being. And, and I think that that's had a significant influence on the way the president approaches things. I mean, I sat in the Oval Office in 2002 and watched the President of the United States make the decision to approve the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, $15 billion over 5 years, spent entirely on non-citizens, with almost no lobbying of the White House to do such a thing, and very little political pressure that we experienced, that eventually is going to bring AIDS drugs to 2 million people, prevent the infections of millions more. And it was, in a lot of ways, a historic experience. I mean, I knew from my reading of history that other people had sat in other government meetings, in other rooms, in Beijing and in Berlin and, in Moscow, and, made calmly debated decisions that resulted in genocide and the death of millions. And it is possible. I mean, politics can be a wonderful thing as well. To sit, I've sat in a room and watched a decision made that was going to result in saving the lives of millions of people. And that's, some of that is the president's instinct, some of it is the American history, some of it is our basic founding commitments, these kind of basic views. So, I do believe that idealism can be a powerful force, a kind of religiously rooted idealism can be a powerful force in diplomacy and in international relations in American politics.
I'd be interested in some of your experiences.
Yeah, I think of, since I was the head of USA, the foreign aid budget, where does it come from, what drives it? And nobody knows that any more than Andrew Natsios and I. And you sort of have to be in that. Andrew followed me in the office in President Bush's first term. But I want to go back for a minute to answer that question to Tanzania, to Dar es Salaam. We were in the embassy there, and on Sundays we went to a variety of churches, basically sort of an international church. But we had colleagues, the Finnish ambassador and his wife, Ilari and Birgitta Rantakari. And they went to the Anglican church, the cathedral downtown. And sometimes each of us would get sort of tired of, for a variety of reasons, where we were going. And the four of us, the two husbands and wives, would meet together on Sunday mornings in our house, in their place, and have a breakfast, and swim, or go and sit in sauna. If the Finns love to sit in sauna, and sit with them there. And we would read scripture. Sometimes, actually, they would sing. Betty and I didn't sing, but Ilari and Birgitta would sing some Christian songs for us. And then sometimes we'd listen to a tape that that we got from somewhere. But since we became close friends, of course, and we worked together, and we were in a developing country. So the question of foreign aid comes up between us. And so one time I said, what is it that really drives your Finnish foreign aid? Why has Finland got such a huge embassy in Tanzania? Where's the connection? No, Tanzanians living in Finland. What's the connection? And he said it's our Lutheran faith. It's our Christian Lutheran faith that drives completely and totally our foreign assistance programs. And most of their foreign assistance is in Africa. I think Ethiopia and some other black African countries, other recipients of Finnish aid. And really, in discussions at other times with other Nordics, they'll say that their faith, while they may not be from a Christian view, some of the other Nordics say, yeah, it's our humanitarian. That's the total driver of our foreign assistance, why we help Tanzanians. But it was really always, I can hear this conversation that we had with Ilari and Birgitta and the depth of their faith and why that motivated them to do this in Tanzania. The USA foreign aid program is not driven in exactly that same way. Some of the things that Michael just said, I agree wholeheartedly, and especially I want to commend President Bush for PEPFAR. It's a remarkable thing that he did and is doing, and I think we all should be greatly appreciative of it. And a lot of World Vision and a lot of people in African countries and other places are going to benefit greatly because of what he's done. I was in a meeting in Bonn of all the international development agency heads, my equivalent in Europe and Japan and Australia. And they all sort of beat up on us Americans. The French, they leave aside, but they don't really usually invite them, but they really beat up on the Americans over this very issue. What drives your foreign aid? You Americans do it. You let your foreign policy control how you help developing countries too much. You'll help ones that you think, are your friends, and maybe the ones that are enemies, you don't help them at all. And the only other country that the Europeans would criticize was the Japanese. And they always said their foreign aid program was basically selling Toyota Land Cruisers. Toyota Land Cruisers is a nice thing to have, but there's a bit more to it than that. So what drives it? It can be a real complicated question. We don't have time, but I do want to make the point that there are lots of drivers of our foreign aid in Washington. Some of it certainly is just what we've talked about, our just sort of American compassion that we have for a whole lot of historical reasons, the Enlightenment, and to some extent, I think the Judeo-Christian understanding of man creating God's image, and just a concern for the poor, and we're really a generous people, and that is certainly a driver to some extent. And then there are specific, forgive the labels of more liberal or more conservative Christians who tend to lobby for certain things or against certain things in the foreign aid budget. Condoms are not a favorite of, at least when I was there, especially as you get into more conservative Christian circles, condoms in the HIV/AIDS battle, the more to the middle and to the left, you tend to think, okay, condoms can be something that we can sell or distribute in AIDS-prone areas. What country in the world? It's probably still true, except Iraq and Afghanistan. They're at war, so they're different. But what one country in the world is the highest per capita recipient of USAID, U.S. foreign assistance? It's not Israel. That's a separate issue. What developing country? There's no way you're going to know the answer to this question unless you worked for me and one or two of you in here did. The answer is Armenia. Now, why in the world is that? The Armenian American lobbying in Washington. They're very strong. And so they're a developing country, and they have the highest per capita recipients of our money. The country that outside, well, it gets complicated with Israel, but outside, I think, Iraq and Afghanistan, I think this is probably still true. The country that sees the largest amount of our foreign aid is Egypt. And the reason for that is the Middle East peace process. So again, that's a large chunk of our foreign aid development money. Also, Jordan gets a big part of that. And then the Palestinian, what we used to call the Palestinian Authority. Do we call it that anymore, Michael?
I think it is.
I guess we still call it the PA. The Palestinians have a big chunk of that. And what drives that? That's driven by our national security. And Secretary Albright, God bless her, used to lobby for the USA budget. She would, and I think Secretary Rice has done the same thing. She lobbied for our foreign aid budget on the Hill. When I was in office, the White House was Democratic and the House and Senate were Republican. And so Secretary Albright would go up with me and she would say, this aid budget is a national security budget. Now that's sort of marketing. She was trying to sell that, but she believed it, and I believe it. And you hear today, Secretary Gates, current Defense Secretary Gates, in David Brooks' column the other day in the Times, said that when the Cold War ended, there were two things we really did wrong. And the first thing he said was we reduced USAID's budget, and the second thing was we got rid of the U.S. Information Agency. So, there's a recognition by people really on both sides of the aisle that the foreign aid budget, especially after 9/11, I think, maybe is a lot more important than we thought it was before 9/11. And there are lots of debates about terrorism and poverty, and are they interrelated?
Let me just comment. I mean, there's two things that are from my perspective, absolutely true. One of them is since the beginning of the Bush administration, there have been the largest percentage increases in foreign assistance since the Marshall Plan. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's for a variety of reasons, but it's a recognition of a post 9/11 reality that we need other instruments to affect kind of the world other than military instruments and other things. And it's still a widow's mite from a billionaire. I mean, as a percentage of our economy, as a percentage of our budget, it's very small. And there are a lot of good people, one campaign, a lot of others who are pushing out there for doing the type of effort that would be commensurate with, first of all, our ambitions in the world, to promote stability and hope and other things. And then also our kind of moral commitments. So it's interesting to me that in polling that Gates and others have done, if you look at what's the constituency for foreign assistance in the United States, it's an interesting breakdown because it's not Republican-Democrat. Among Democrats, the lowest support for foreign assistance tends to be blue-collar Democrats, union households, who want every first dollar spent on health care and a lot of other things. College-educated tend to be much more supportive of foreign assistance. On the Republican side, secular Republicans are the least supportive of foreign assistance. Religious Republicans are much more supportive of arguments about American moral leadership, moral responsibility in the world. And you find that dynamic on the Hill. I mean, I was involved in helping put together, a program that went together to slowly the Millennium Challenge, approach that we took, and it was implemented too slowly, and I think those changes have been made. But it has been viewed by Republicans and Democrats as an easy source of offsets for veterans programs and a lot of other things. And it's really been a bipartisan, effort to undermine those programs. And so it's an interesting question. How do you build a constituency for foreign assistance in the United States, a principled constituency? People need to be convinced that it works. And I've been around enough, not nearly as much as you, but I've been, several places in Africa. I've been on several of these trips, and it does work. It really does, particularly when you work in ways that where you're working cooperatively with local people and building local capacity. It can have a real influence. But a lot of Americans, if you look at the polling and the numbers, are not convinced that's true. They think it's thrown down on whole. And we can't go into all of that. There's a big academic debate because there's almost no relationship between our aid levels and economic growth in foreign countries. Okay. So some people use that to say it can't work. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means that we probably need a better theory on how you promote long-term economic growth because we haven't been very good at it for 40 years. But I have seen from malaria, AIDS, a lot of local projects, water, women's empowerment, things that America can do really well. That there's extraordinary results, but I think Americans need to be convinced of that.
Michael, you said that evangelical social engagement is surging on humanitarian issues, in particular on Sudan, on the HIV/AIDS issue, and on human trafficking, and you've been very involved with the administration's commitments to those expenditures in the budget. I wonder how much, for Christians who are serious about humanitarian commitment, I think there's some confusion. The United States has the largest aid budget in cash terms of any industrialized country. As a proportion of gross national product, it's one of the lowest. Right. As you said, the widow's mite from a billionaire. There is groups like the One Campaign that you're involved with have urged Christians and churches to be involved in advocating for more government assistance, foreign aid dollars going to poor countries. There's also a feeling amongst churches and Christians in the United States but we also give a lot through churches and Christians organizations and NGOs like World Vision or World Relief or Habitat for Humanity, all these groups. I'm confused. Should it be government assistance or should it be through Christian organizations we can trust? There's a sort of implicit parenthesis. Can you help explore some of those issues as well, the balance of government aid versus private aid and how we as Christians navigate those issues.
I think it is a fact, by the way, that if you total private assistance and public assistance in America, we compete better, as far as the international side. And it is not the European tradition in a lot of countries to turn first to religious NGOs. It's just not their history. I mean, they tend to do things more through government, and that's, I think, a cultural factor in a lot of these areas. But I feel like it's getting. I think it's getting better. I talked with first of all, I think that there's a change going on that's rooted in a very big global historical change, which is the movement of the center of gravity of world Christianity to the global south, and the increase in ties between American Christians and their counterparts in other countries. The short-term mission movement is an extraordinary thing and has opened up the eyes of millions of people every year to kind of see the challenges of the developing world through a set of eyes, through other Christians that they work with. I think you look at kind of this head-snapping change in generational leadership between people of the kind of religious right of the 1980s and 90s to people like Rick Warren and Gary Haugen that are really awakening many people to these extraordinary challenges and spiritual vitality. It was my experience, because I came to it fairly late, that I expected to go to Africa and feel pity, and I felt awe. I felt extraordinary respect for some of the strongest people in some of the most difficult circumstances I had ever seen. And the more people have that experience themselves, the more committed they're going to be to these type of issues. But I think you're correct. I mean, I think we have a kind of growing global awareness among evangelicals related to some very large historical trends that's playing itself out in the Anglican Communion and a lot of other places, where I come from. At the same time, you still do have, if you look at these numbers, some skepticism about whether the U.S. government does this effectively. And it's the reason wherever I go, it's the reason I think that PEPFAR is important, not just for the lives it saves, but because, a lot of foreign assistance, it's hard to measure outcomes in the short term. Okay? But the more Americans know about this type of effort, I think the more confidence they gain. I mean, I was in Addis not too long ago at a Sisters of Charity orphanage, where you have 400 HIV-positive children, all of whom have either lost their parents to AIDS or been abandoned because they had AIDS themselves. And up until about 2.5 years ago, something like that, every single child died before the age of 9 or 10. And now you go, and they're planning for, for job training for 16-year-olds, and what they're going to do next. And they're hardly losing any children, except as some, really bad opportunistic infections and things. But they hardly lose any children at this orphanage. And it is a modern miracle. It's just extraordinary. It's done largely by the American people. It's appreciated. You look at the numbers, like the Pew Global, survey on these things, and this isn't entirely new, but it's supported this trend that, 7 of the top 10 countries where America is most popular are African countries, and it's some of that at least is because of high-profile initiatives that show we actually the American people care, and they do. They care especially when they think it's working, and I think it can.
Yeah, I agree. They need, because the perception has been for so long that it's, as our old friend Jesse Helms, when he was chair of foreign relations, used to say, money down a rat hole. It's just and he, back in the days when he was trying to get rid of USAID, and he sort of had a turnaround. Franklin Graham, I give credit to Franklin for sort of helping Senator Helms realize that we had a Christian obligation. And Franklin did this privately with Senator Helms. We had Christians had a moral obligation to help people, and you need to, quit worrying about how much, if something's wasted or somebody's still, you need to help people, and then, and Senator Helms kind of backed off some near the end of his career about that. but it's a struggle, and I think that we need more people, both in the White House and on the Hill, both sides, to go back home and to step out and say this is. And I think they can now that 9/11 is. I mean, I think that before it was harder for them. When I was still in office, we had a hearing, a House International Relations Committee hearing, and on the budget, and I was asked a lot of questions. I noticed there was one Southern Republican congressman from a neighboring state of where I grew up who had some interesting questions. He was a bit hostile, but I thought there was some value here, so I made an effort to see him after the hearing, and we had a chat, and there was more interest, and so so I went to his office at some point, got an appointment, and went to see him, and he had an understanding, he really did, that foreign assistance can be of a help to the American people because we're improving the lives of people in these countries, and that was in our own interest. And I said, well, would you? But he said, people back home in my district, I mean, I can't. They don't think that way. I said, well, Congressman, do you want me? I'd be glad to come. And he said, you're the last person I want to come to my district. I said, and finally, through the conversation, I got frustrated. I said, well, who's going to do it if it isn't you? And aren't you a leader? I mean, didn't the people elect you not just to reflect them, but you tell me you agree with this. This is important to you. Maybe it's up to you to go back there and tell them. I kind of got a little frustrated with him. I suspect he did not because he's been reelected several times since then. He's still in the House, and I suspect he didn't. But maybe now, I don't know. Maybe now is the time, and President Bush has broken down some barriers in some ways.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. You look at the 108 campaign, and it is co-chaired by Senator Frist and Senator Daschle, which is a great thing.
Yeah,
and Senator Frist has a pithy way of putting things, and he said, people don't want to kill you when you save their children. Right. And I think that's it's a little simplistic, but it's good. But it's good. It's real.
And excuse me, and it does work. Yes, was something work? You need to know what you're trying to achieve. One, I mean, if you drill a well and it's a sustainable sort of mechanics to the water well, and health improves in the village for a long period of time, is that a good thing? I think so. I think you've improved some of God's children's lives there. Is the country more stable because of that? Well, I don't know. Maybe there needs some other things that have to. Because I'm telling you, in this development business, a whole bunch of things have to happen. A bunch of things have to happen together. And you've got to have peace. And that's why my friend John Aronson, who's sitting back here, John, who goes to Tanzania, John grew up in Tanzania. He now teaches up at Houghton. And he has some students with him. And John goes to southern Tanzania every year and takes students down there. And it'd be a fun thing to do, to go with them down there to learn the culture and anthropology and stuff. And he tells me all the improvements that he's observed over these years since I really was last out there 6 or 7 years ago. And it's a result of a whole lot of little steps. And as I said, the Nordics spent a lot of money in Tanzania that was wasted because it was a bad idea. But some of it was, it takes time. I mean, one of the things that we Americans, we want it to happen yesterday. And you don't build healthy, safe, secure societies with healthy children who laugh and play in the streets, and with elderly who can feel safe when they walk out along the banks of the river at night. These don't just happen. And a lot of the people in the world don't live that way. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for it. And all of us in the West and along with colleagues more and more from developing countries are in agreement. Really, a lot of agreement coming together as to what causes just enduring poverty and where the conflict can come, and things like girls' education. I mean, almost nobody these days disagrees that girls' education is probably the most important thing you can do in a developing country. It's just absolutely wonderful. I was just in Peru, and I saw that with the Quechua people living up, they're descendants of the Incas, living up in the 15,000 feet in the mountains. I can barely breathe. And Wycliffe Bible Translators has a literacy program for women because the Bible was translated in Quechua some time ago, but these women, it's a closed book to them. So a special literacy program for women. And I asked these women, they were in their 40s and 50s, I said, do you want your daughters to learn to read and write Quechua? Oh, they went nuts. That was the question they were waiting for. Yes, we want our daughters. The first women in the history of the Quechua people to ever learn to read and write their own language, and they wanted their daughters and their granddaughters to. So there's a lot of good things going on in the developing world that we can be proud of. And if we can get people on both sides of the aisle, if we can keep this from being a liberal or conservative issue or this part, okay, there's certain little bits we may have to argue about, but the broader scope of assisting people in developing countries, there's a lot of reasons for us in this room to agree that it's a good idea, but it's going to take leadership.
Like we're trying with this conversation. In fact,
absolutely.
To create that exact
We
environment.
appreciate the opportunity.
We do want to take some questions from the floor. As we get the microphone ready and as you articulate and formulate your question and line up, I wanted to throw out some questions or promote discussion on a topic that may provide some heat, and that is Michael's referred to, if we only saw the impact that assistance makes on the ground, this very beautiful quote of, people don't want to kill you when you save their children. The Middle East can be a flashpoint for that, and in particular, the U.S. assistance to Israel and to Palestine, both our speakers have referred to that as a controversial aspect of U.S. foreign policy. Brady, I know you have had some very personal dealings with the Palestinian Authority, and perhaps you can just take us there a little bit and tell us some of your interactions there.
Yeah. Probably nobody has said this next statement I'm going to make. Nobody's ever said this to you. Jesus is a Palestinian. Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus was a Palestinian. Jesus was a Palestinian. Has anybody ever told you that? Have you ever thought about that? Yasser Arafat told me. Jesus was a Palestinian. Now, this was as he and I sat in his suite of rooms up, what's it, the Four Seasons where he used to, I can't remember where he stays. When he comes, or when he used to come, he stayed somewhere over here. I think it was in the Four Seasons. And we're sitting on this little love seat holding hands. You get to do these fun things when you're in these jobs. Hold hands with Yasser Arafat on a love seat. And I would hate for that little clip to be taken out. I could never run for public office, could I? He said, Jesus was a Palestinian. Now, I don't know. At the time, I wanted to say, yeah, he was also a Jew. I didn't say that because I wasn't there to argue with him. I had other reasons to be there to discuss things with him. But he obviously was trying to get that identity going. He was saying, the Israelis are not really your friend. You're a Christian, and the Israelis aren't really your friend. That's not what that was his implication. Your real friends, I'm your real friend. The Palestinian people are your real friend. Jesus was a Palestinian. Saab Erekat, who was Arafat's chief negotiator, and he still is. How he survived the transition, I don't know, but Saab is really very good, and you see him sometimes you hear him on NPR, you see him, but he's the chief Palestinian negotiator and talks with us and the Israelis. And Saab told me one time that, as the USAID administrator, I spent a lot of time with the Palestinians because of this Middle East peace thing. I didn't spend any time with Israelis. So it's kind of one-sided. But Saab told me about his family experience one time. He said his two daughters, and Saab, he's sobbing, he's crying as he's telling me this. His daughter's coming home from school where other Muslim Palestinian children had spit upon them, and they still had spit, he said, in their hair. And the reason that they were spat upon was because Saab was willing to negotiate or talk to the Americans and the Israelis, and therefore his children were, and Saab, his family, were labeled as turncoats by some of the Palestinian people. And Saab was trying to make the point that this ain't easy for us. That is us being he and Arafat and the people that were willing to negotiate with us. There were many others who didn't, in their group, who didn't want to. So it gets to be a real personal. I spent a lot of time with him. He gave me a tour of the church in the Nativity. I had a Muslim give me a tour, the only tour I ever had, the church in the Nativity in Bethlehem. And so then I came home from that trip, and I was really moved by a lot of things. And I came home, and I told you earlier about our large Jewish community I grew up with, and two guys are close friends of mine. One's named David, and David has gotten really kind of excited about his Jewish identity in his, our old age. And he's been back to Israel several times and kind of getting into the whole thing. And when I got back, he was all excited. He knew I'd been, I was going to go, and, what'd you see, and where'd you go, and who'd you talk to? And I was uncomfortable. I think that's the personal part of the story that I told Matt. I'm uncomfortable in a way talking about it now. It's difficult with my close Jewish friends, Jewish history, all this in the context of what's going on now in the Middle East, and to relate to these Palestinians and see suffering that's going on in their community. A lot of which maybe some of them are responsible for. I'm not saying they're not. Some of it the Israelis, some of it we've made bad decisions. But these are people, they're human beings. Some of them were, of course, Christians. So many of them have had to leave. But it gets to be a real emotional, wrenching thing when you start meeting people, as our colleague, the Muslim colleagues said this morning. You start meeting somebody and talking to them, and they become real. Now, Arafat was kind of more of a figure. I can't say I ever broke through any personal thing with him, but with some of the others I did. And